Well, thank you for your patience over these last 48 hours. For me, it's been a fantastic time, and we've really appreciated the richness, the diversity, the wisdom, and the creativity that we've heard. I asked Hannah to be our chief listening officer over the last 48 hours and tasked her with just reflecting back on some of the key things she heard. It's a tough thing to ask someone, but I know that Hannah will give us just a brief overview for about 10 minutes, and then we'll close with some info and some prayers. Hannah, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Ben, for this not insubstantial challenge of listening over the last couple of days and trying to briefly reflect back some of what I've heard. There's been so much rich content that it's really hard to know where to start in summarising it or reflecting it or bringing out some of the important things. So don't take it personally if I haven't mentioned your particular persecutor. There's been so many that I'm going to try and bring some of them together. So at the start of the first lockdown, a couple of friends and I set out to read a psalm every day with little idea whether the lockdown, the pandemic, or the book would last longer. We got to the end of August in the end, having read all 150, and with the world still feeling more than a little adrift and surreal, but feeling reassured, I think, by how often in the year we'd been asking ourselves how long this would go on for, along with the words of the psalmists we were reading, also asking how long. And this time around in lockdown, we've been reading the book of Acts, and we settled on this as something to read during lockdown, not for any great theological reason, but because there's 28 chapters, and we hoped there would be 28 days to the lockdown period. And I've loved reading it cover to cover. It reads a lot like a storybook or a novel. And I guess because it's the story of the early church. And I found myself looking forward to the next chapter or the next episode in a way I can't say I've always felt about reading other books of the Bible. So I suppose it's natural that much of the conversation over the last 2 days has resonated with me in the context not only of the church today, but the early church. And so the first thing I want to say that I've kind of heard is that none of this is new. And I mean that in the most encouraging way, not in a no one's got anything new to say kind of way. Jenny spoke this morning about the ancient and new ideas of being neighbours, which is radical, but it also isn't. And Joel began yesterday by highlighting brilliantly how since the beginning of the church, Christians have been figuring out together what discipleship means in the context of power, race, different dynamics of society, class, gender, even plagues. He mentioned the early church's emergency services, the parabolani, I think he called them, who sat with the sick and the dying and risked their lives in doing so. I think we might see ourselves in that in 2020, whether literally or not. Stephen this morning described cathedrals as the hospital wards of the church, resuscitating the faith of those on the brink of losing it and sitting with those people who were in that position. And I wonder if there is always space in our understanding of what it is to be disciples, to be the spiritual emergency services in that way, to be there for the people whose faith is struggling and dying, not just those who are physically ill. And the second thing that I think has been a common strand through much of our conversations has been that we're doing it together. So many of the speakers have talked about that we're collaborating, creating community, journeying with each other, going on pilgrimage together, carrying the bags for others who are on pilgrimages, just to pick out some of the phrases that others have used. And I think this is really important for us to remember. It's been highlighted numerous times that discipleship is not, despite how we might sometimes think of it, an individual thing or something that we do on our own or for our own. There's something also really transformative, I think, about inviting others to join in with us. To briefly plug my own research, I found that social action grows the church in part because people who aren't in church are attracted by the goodness of it and want to be part of it, even if they don't realise they're interested in faith. And I think that's a really important part of being missionary disciples, that as we're being it, other people want to join in. And the journey of learning together to be missionary disciples together is also about sharing everything together. And this is obviously central to the book of Acts. Chapter 4 says that all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. something I've heard again woven through all the talks is that sense of people sharing everything they have. Rachel and her story of community living, sharing bathrooms and mugs and a crockery cupboard takes that very literally, as does Ali's inspiring example of the new housing hub. But it's also true in terms of knowledge, tradition, and experience. I thought Jackie from the Church of God of Prophecy illustrated this brilliantly when she began her talk with the words of Pope Francis about the church living in the midst of the homes of its sons and daughters. That sense as well of not being possessive about our tradition, but sharing the good in everything, quoting people from different traditions and recognising the value that they can add to our conversation. And I think that's the spirit of CTE, I think, but certainly the spirit of this gathering as well. Thirdly, I think that sense that some of us have felt this year of being torn between so many different issues of justice and injustice is also nothing new, but neither is our instinct that as Christians, part of our calling is to be the people working in there, to be missionary disciples. There was a really interesting chat in one of the small groups that I was in yesterday about what is the defining issue of our time, or the defining issue of the millennial generation that we talk about. Was it identity politics, or racial justice and Black Lives Matter, or the economy, or the pandemic, or the list went on. Dan Snow, who's a historian who does TV programmes, recently started a bit of a debate on Twitter when he suggested that in the scheme of things, so 100 years from now, history would completely forget the coronavirus pandemic. It seems mad to suggest that when 2020 has felt so momentous. Mad as well that if we wrote a storybook of the contemporary church in the same way that Acts is for the early church, we wouldn't focus on those issues of justice and the things that we've been going through as a community and as a society this year. And yet, to look at Acts, that's kind of what it is. We know that all of those issues I have just listed and many more were really critical to the early church. They do get a mention in Acts, but they're not the defining thing. Instead, the verse that I think kind of sums up what was going on, what it meant to be missionary disciples in the beginning of the church, is Acts chapter 4, 33 and 34. And that says, "And God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there was no needy person among them." And I think that kind of to take away from this conference in our mission, in our discipleship, looking at what the church is and what the church might be, what we might be together going into 2021 even. That's my prayer, my hope. And also what I think we are heading towards. That not because of our actions or because of our programs and our understandings of these are so great, but that God's grace would be so powerfully at work in us going forward, that there would be no needy person among us, and that would be what defines us, not only the issues of justice and what we've learned from the pandemic and what we've collectively experienced, but that we would be defined by God's grace and unity in all of us. And I think that is my main the main thing that I've heard and hoped for over the last couple of days.